It's my great pleasure to introduce our very first speaker, Dr. Craig Hazen, and the first session is going to be split between Dr. Craig Hazen and also Dr. J.P. Moreland, and just well-known apologists, each of them, and then we'll have a break, and then we'll come back for the second half on the subject of intelligent design with Dr. Paul Nelson. But again, we'll start off with Dr. Craig Hazen, who is a professor of comparative religion and Christian apologetics at Biola University, and he's the director of the Apologetics department there. Just an amazing department there. Many of you are very, very familiar with what they do there. He's also the editor of a Christian philosophy journal called Philosophia Christi. Many of you are subscribers, I'm sure, to that. And he has authored and contributed to just a wide range of books and scholarly works, including To Everyone an Answer, the Apologetics Study Bible, and a breakout new novel called Five Sacred Crossings, which, by the way, is available in our bookstore there. Dr. Hazen holds a PhD in religious studies and a degree in biological sciences, and he's been educated in international human rights in Strasbourg, France. I mean, he's just a really highly educated individual. At Biola, he was named the winner of the Fisher Award for Faculty Excellence, which is the highest faculty honor you can get at Biola. And Dr. Hazen has lectured all over North America and Europe on the evidence for the resurrection, religion and science, and Christianity among other world religions. He's also lectured at the White House and on Capitol Hill. And he's the former co-host of a national radio talk program and a regular on-camera expert for broadcast television. And anyone that's heard him on the radio, you can tell he's very, very winsome, but also very clear and articulate, communicates very well, succinctly, and so I'm really jazzed about having him here with the rest of the speakers here. He and his wife Karen live in Southern California, and they have 4 children. So without any further delay, let's welcome Dr. Craig Hazen to the podium.
This is really fun to be with you. We never thought this would happen in Texas, really. I don't know what it is about Texas. We've been trying to break ground in terms of apologetics, Christian thought, and philosophy in Texas for a long time. But we kept running into this thing where Texas folks generally thought all their neighbors were Christians, you know? Maybe you started finding pentagrams on your door or something and it alarmed you. I don't know. But I'm thrilled to be here. And thank you, Charles. Thank you, Pastor Tommy. Hey, special greetings from Biola University. Yeah. Yeah. I can tell the older folks who are cheering. Their children got financial aid. That's why they're cheering. Yeah. Good. Yeah, Biola University is a funny place in Southern California. It's 100 years old. Now, on the East Cost, that doesn't mean much, but in Southern California, that's a big deal, you know. And it's been very faithful to the Word of God. In fact, here's a funny thing about Biola. I mean, this is a school that actually believes in biblical inerrancy, and we think it's defensible. It's not just some faith commitment we have, but we actually think that's a defensible idea. So Biola's been here 100 years, but think of this. We've got more students studying philosophy at the graduate level than any school in the world. I know you don't think about that with the Biola, the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, to have such prowess in philosophy. Well, you're going to meet some of our philosophers tonight and tomorrow, and I think you'll see why it's become the biggest program anywhere. So, dig that. So I got there, I've been at Biola about 14 years. By the way, that number, with regard to philosophy, doesn't even count the apologetics program. You know, there's over 200 students in the Christian Apologetics Master of Arts degree program, and that doesn't count our Science and Religion program, our MA degree in Science and Religion. So, and these are 2 very prominent programs and making a big splash. But I've been there 14 years, and I remember when I first got there, my colleagues pointed me to some computers and said, you got to log into this thing called BUBS. It's the Biola University Bulletin Board system, right? And it's really cool. And I log in, and they said, you can find out what the students are thinking and what they're doing and what's on their mind, and it's a great way to stay in touch with the students. So I log in, and I was totally impressed immediately because the students were having a contest, right? A contest. The contest was, what's the best theory on anything, you know? It was wide open. People were, I don't know what the prize was, but people were making posts and offering up ideas. And here's the grand prize winner. This is one of my first introductions to the student body at Biola. This student proposes this grand prize winning theory in the subject of thermodynamics. See? Now, Biola doesn't have an engineering school, so this is especially impressive. This guy writes, when a cat is dropped, it always lands on its feet. And when toast is dropped, it always lands buttered side down. I propose that we strap giant slabs of hot buttered toast to the back of 100 tethered cats. The two opposing forces will cause the cats to hover, spinning just inches above the ground. Using a giant buttered toast cat array, a high-speed monorail could easily link Los Angeles and Palm Springs, cutting hours off of our travel time during spring break. So I was thrilled with the Biola students. Now, we don't have an engineering program, but we have a wonderful creative writing program, and I think that shows. Wow. Yeah, I mentioned a couple of degree programs. This is the commercial aspect of the evening. That's why they put me first, because I'm kind of a pitch man, I want to talk to you just very briefly about the Master of Arts degree in Christian Apologetics. If you want to get information about this, if you have a bachelor's degree in any subject, you can do a Master of Arts degree in Christian Apologetics. We get you up to speed in theology and biblical studies and philosophy and cultural studies and historical issues. Everything you need to know, we provide for you, and it can be done at a distance. I think we have the finest distance learning program anywhere, certainly in apologetics, but maybe purely in distance learning, this might be the best one yet. Our students rave about it. In fact, we have some in the audience tonight. Whoop, really loud if you're a member of the MA program. Oh, that's more than I expected. We better have a little colloquy afterwards. So that's a Master of Arts degree in Christian Apologetics, learning at a graduate level how to defend the Christian faith, how to present the gospel and offer reasons for your faith. Second program I want to highlight is the Master of Arts degree in Science and Religion. It's the blue one out on a table. All the information's out there. Make sure you pick some up. This is a first-ranked program showing bright, Bible-believing evangelical Christians how to properly integrate science with their Christian beliefs. Right? Finest program of its kind around. There aren't many programs like this, so check that out if you have interest. The third program I want to mention is a certificate program, right? You're thinking, master's degree, well, I've already got a couple of those, and a PhD too. I don't really need another master's degree, but I'm very interested in this. Or maybe you never, went to college, so you really don't qualify for a master's degree. We have a certificate program in Christian Apologetics. It's by far our most popular program. We have thousands of people doing it all over the country, or all over the world at any given time. And you ought to check this out. It's a way of just listening to some of the finest lectures ever given on the Biola campus by our top flight professors, doing some programmed reading and enjoying it immensely. And at the end of your time, you get issued a certificate of achievement in Christian Apologetics, and it's great fun. We even have a huge population for this program in California prisons. It's like one of the biggest educational programs going in California prisons. It's wild. I'm glad we don't have like an on-campus residency for the prisoners. But no, maybe that'd be nice to meet them. By the way, it reminds me that what I tell people when we have these lectures on the Biola campus, because they get kind of intimidated when they hear, J.P. Moreland and Paul Nelson and William Lane Craig. They don't get intimidated hearing me, but with these guys, they get a little intimidated. And they go, wow, I don't know am I going to have to get a PhD to really make my way in this and to be very useful in gospel presentation and defense out in the general public? No. In fact, here's the claim I make to people doing our certificate program or taking our lecture series. I say, if you stick through this and do the certificate, you will rise to the top 5% of religiously literate people in the world. And they go, wow, that must be some certificate program you've developed there. And I say, well, you know what, it's a very good certificate program, but the comment was not about the certificate program, right? The comment was about the very low level of understanding on these things out in the general public. I mean, we can spend just one evening giving you techniques that will build your confidence almost immediately. Because people ask you hard questions. Well, guess what? They're not prepared to answer those same questions when they're tossed right back at them. In fact, a good thing to carry away tonight. Ask of them as they ask of you, right? Why do you believe the Bible? You know? Well, I have actually a lot of reasons for believing the Bible, but I'm curious. What do you believe about the Bible? Oh, my goodness. Then stand back and watch. Watch the nonsense come shooting forth, you know? It really helps the conversation get going. Suddenly you don't feel nearly as nervous or like you have to produce. Now, it works much better when you've really done some hard study. I think that's when you really start to make a nuisance of yourself for the Lord Jesus. And that's what we want to see. One item about products, there's all kinds of stuff out on tables. Let me sort through it quickly for you. We've got a special conference book. This is called the On Guard Conference. We've got a book called On Guard. This is about as low level a book you're ever going to get from William Lane Craig, okay? And most of this is very accessible. He challenges you in a couple of spots, but I encourage every one of you to get this and walk out, get the workbook that goes with it, and really enjoy it. And the folks at the tables wanted me to make sure you knew that they take credit cards, so jump on that. Something else by William Lane Craig. We actually had a debate at Biola University about a year and a half ago now. Does God exist? Dr. William Lane Craig against Christopher Hitchens. It didn't go well for Hitchens. It didn't go well. In fact, I actually like to think of that as a special point at which the new atheism started to really go downhill. You know, because it was one atheist blogger said after the debate, Christopher Hitchens was spanked like an errant schoolboy. And really, it was a bit of a dismantling in kindness and in Christian love, but nonetheless, a dismantling. A book that I wrote called 5 Sacred Crossings. If you find writings in philosophy and apologetics a little bit intimidating or not quite fun, and you love to read stories and novels and such, this is a novel. I actually threw a whole bunch of wonderful Christian ideas in philosophy and apologetics into a novel, and it's actually got a bigger readership than anything else I've written, so I've been very happy about that. And I've discovered through emails that I get in return after people read this, it is the great thing to give to New Age Aunt Sally or your uncle the physicist who you are about to have Thanksgiving dinner with, you know, because they read it and it kind of introduces Christian ideas through the side door. They're not expecting the way they're packaged and delivered. And it actually intrigues them, so consider that. And another book that I think is a must-get at the conference, it's called The God Question by J.P. Moreland. Not only is this a wonderful argument for the existence of God and some of the essential elements of the Christian worldview, but it's done in such a wonderful, personal style. It's as if JP's in the living room giving you his very best take on the Christian life and how fulfilling it can be to believers and to unbelievers. So, The God Question. Check those out. I'll highlight some more tomorrow, but that's enough of that for now. What's going to happen? I'm going to speak for a little while, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague J.P. Moreland for a short time, and he's going to give a small presentation. Then we're going to take a break, and we're going to hear from Paul Nelson. When Paul Nelson gets up, that's going to be the first major presentation. Tomorrow is packed with major presentations, so you want to get here early. Get a big tankard of coffee, get fully caffeinated, and I will do a presentation tomorrow morning, and you'll see in the initial brochure and so on how these are stacked up. And we let you out fairly early, right? So you still have a little bit of an afternoon left. And there's a nice lunch break so you can talk about these ideas and have some great barbecued lunch. That's the project. So let's jump into it. One more comment. By the way, this is a very friendly audience. I just got back from Olympia, Washington. All right? Olympia, Washington is a very dark place. And to see smiling faces who are actually glad that I'm here is happy for me. So I'm up in Olympia, Washington, and this is the second time I did this. Last year I did it for the first time. I came to campus, this very secular campus in Olympia, Washington. I was invited by this teeny tiny Christian group. Right? I don't know how many members, maybe 3, maybe 4. I kid you not. So they invite me to give a lecture. You know, they thought, let's bring a Christian guy on this campus and see what happens. So I prepared a little talk, and I was prepared to take some questions, but on the way to the room where I was to speak, I see a poster on the wall. And the poster said, well, it had my name on it. And it had flames around my name. And it said, "Come barbecue the Christian." This was, or grill the Christian, something. That was the name of the event, It turns out they wheel in huge, wheelbarrows full of barbecued chicken wings. This is the enticement to get the secular students out into this classroom. And the smell is just wafting through the hallways. And if they listen to me answer their questions for an hour, they get a big plate of the best chicken wings. And this place is famous in Olympia, Washington. Best barbecued chicken wings in town, And so they actually got a big turnout. There were professors in there and grad students and, oh my goodness. And so I gave a small opening statement and they just started firing questions out at me. The whole atheist club was sitting in the front row with t-shirts on. And, I've been in the apologetics business for a long time. And the quality of the questions was different than they were, say, 20 years ago. I think the questions were stupider. In fact, they were stupider. It was as if everybody in the room had learned everything they know about Christianity from reading the Da Vinci Code. It was not that challenging. In fact, I found myself having to help them ask more challenging questions. Sir, that would be a very good question if you twist it this way. Then I might be challenged by it, And, oh my goodness. In fact, it got kind of slow at one point. They stopped asking questions. They were probably just getting hungry. But they knew they had to keep this up for an hour, so they're looking at each other, and one guy raises his hand, "Yes, sir." He goes, you can tell he's just reaching for something. "Do you believe in baptism?" And I said, "Sir, not only do I believe in it, I've seen it done." Yeah. Then this woman comes up to me afterwards, and she had already made a pilgrimage to the barbecue chicken. She had a big plate of them. And she already had schmutz on her face, And she's waving a chicken wing at me. So the preacher's going to get sauce on me. But she had a very important question. Actually, it was more of a comment. She goes, my big problem with the Bible is there not enough women in it? I said, really? I just got through reading the book of Esther, and I've enjoyed Ruth and read about Deborah and Mary and all this. And she goes, "Yeah, well, that's okay and everything." I go, I had no idea what she was getting at, really. So I said, so I started to mess with her. I know what you mean. Sort of like, instead of the 3 wise men, maybe it should be the 3 wise women. And she's like, "Yeah, that's the thing." And honestly, that's kind of a secular idea that we just kind of make this stuff up. A new Bible version comes out and we can edit it, to match cultural mores. She's like, "Yeah, that's the thing." I go, "Oh yeah, actually that makes a lot of sense because think about it. Women ask for directions. So they would have arrived on time. They would have helped deliver the baby, for goodness sakes, They would have cleaned the stable. They would have made a casserole and brought practical gifts, Makes a lot of sense to me. Yep. So I'm glad to be with you here this morning. I did my doctoral work at the University of California at Santa Barbara, which has a top flight. Did I hear a whoop? Go Gauchos! That's almost as bad as UC Santa Cruz. Go banana slugs. Yes. Are you a banana slug? Oh, God bless him. Hope he brings you a T-shirt, from the school. So it was wonderful, though. I entered this religious studies program, to do doctoral work, and it's very secular. It's about as secular a religious studies program as you can find in North America. And here I come in, I knew what I was getting into. I'd studied some apologetics and Christian philosophy, and I think I was fairly well prepared for such a thing. And I go in, a Jesus-loving, Bible-believing Christian, and I actually came out more Jesus-loving and Bible-believing than I went in. That wasn't the case with all the Christians. who entered the program, who were very, very few in number to begin with, because you get beaten up pretty good in that program. But man, after having the wonderful experience of comparing my conservative Bible evangelical beliefs to all of the beliefs of the great world religious traditions, like Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism and Mormonism and you name it. This was a wonderful experience. I discovered something about Christianity that it is very different from these other traditional religious faiths. Very different. And this is my area of specialty. If I had another lecture to give you, I would give you a lecture on exactly that, why Christianity stands apart. But I'll be talking about the resurrection of Jesus tomorrow, and that, of course, is one excellent reason that, one excellent thing that propels Christianity apart from the pack. So I got a chance to immerse myself into all this, and there are many things I discovered that set Christianity apart from the other great traditions. I'm going to highlight one in my very brief time with you tonight, and that is this. Christianity is testable. It's testable. You can offer evidence for it. You can offer evidence against it, and the evidence means something. Christianity really doesn't have much to do with blind leaping. Never has. And if that's the case in your church, hopefully you can maybe adjust that a little bit. I mean, you can discover Christ through blind leaping, but it's not the preferred mode. It's certainly not the mode taught by the prophets, by Jesus, and by his apostles. They wanted to present a religious faith where you can walk into it with your eyes wide open and investigate it and discover it. It's testable. In fact, let me read to you one of the strangest passages in all of religious literature. You're not going to find something like this in the Bhagavad Gita or in the Buddhist Tripitaka or the Quran or the Book of Mormon. This comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 15. You got to check this out. This is crazy stuff in terms of modern religious sensibilities. The Apostle Paul writes this in 1 Corinthians 15. He's writing about resurrection, and in the course of doing so, he says a couple of things that are a bit startling. Here it is, starting with verse 12, chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians. Paul writes, "But if it is preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? If there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." Get the linkage there? No Jesus back from the dead, your faith is empty or worthless. He goes on. "More than that, we are then found to be false witnesses about God, for we have testified about God that he raised Christ from the dead. But he did not raise him if in fact the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, empty, worthless." Oh my goodness, what was he thinking? Really, by the way, if you're going to start your own religion, don't do it that way. Bad idea. It's funny because after doing a doctorate in religious studies, I actually thought I could teach a class in how to start your own religion. And lesson one would be don't do this. Because if you make that kind of claim, you had better be prepared to back it up. And there were people circulating in Paul's lifetime who could pull the plug on that idea and send this primitive Christian thinking crashing to the earth immediately. In other words, he hung Christianity by a thread, right? The thread of the resurrection. Now, it turns out that thread is made out of some super titanium alloy that breaks any pair of scissors that gets near it. Right? We'll talk about that tomorrow morning, the kind of evidence there is leading back to this idea. The Apostle Paul was taken with this idea, not just because he thought it was wonderful and moved him deeply, but he had seen the resurrected Jesus. And he had great confidence in God that he would preserve this idea by laying out a tremendous trail of evidence leading down to our time so that we could know it too. Christianity is about knowledge. We can know these things to be true. Now, this idea that Christianity is testable, that you can offer evidence for our key beliefs, like the resurrection of Jesus, really unnerves folks in the general religious studies establishment. Right? In fact, I remember I went to a conference, this must have been a decade ago now, And it was a very secular religion and philosophy conference. Some of the biggest names in Southern California and around the country were there giving papers and listening to each other. And one of my old teachers, his name was John Warwick Montgomery. You probably know that name. He was one of these guys with more degrees than a thermometer. He was doing a Friday evening plenary address at this conference. And it had a really provocative title, and so it actually drew quite a crowd. No, you don't get an evangelical Christian speaking at something like this very often, and so I got there early, and it was one of those chemistry lecture halls, big lecture hall, had those seats with the little desks that fold up and over, periodic table of elements on the wall. So the place begins to fill up. I had my aisle seat, very comfortable. Had my little desk folded up and over, leaning on it, right? Ready for things to begin. Standing room only by the time they introduce the speaker. They introduce him. He reaches into his briefcase and he pulls out some papers and he blows on them and dust flies off. That was all part of the drama because he was reading a paper as if it were a long-lost manuscript written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes mystery story writer, And that's a good thing for Montgomery. He was a former president of the Sherlock Holmes Society in London, among other things, So he delivers this paper, and it was fascinating. It was as if Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson were investigating religious truth claims in the various religions. And as you know, Watson and Sherlock were going step by step through the evidence, using only very careful reasoning to make sense of all of this. And by the end of the presentation, there was only one religious view left standing, and that was Christianity. Well, that didn't go over very well, In fact, I remember sitting across the aisle from a guy. He was a tall, fair-skinned fellow. I remember he was fair-skinned because his white earlobes were turning a strange color of purple during the presentation. And right when they finished, before they could even call for questions from the audience, this guy leaps to his feet, right? He forgets to fold back that little desk, So to this day, we don't know the actual pitch of his voice. And we don't know if it was pain or his anger, He's twitching and thrashing. Dr. Montgomery, you do tremendous damage to religion. Well, what was that? I think everybody in the crowd knew what it was, but I was a little slow on the uptake. He didn't like the idea that Montgomery gave real-life comparisons to religious truth claims. In other words, Montgomery had grabbed religion by the collar and had dragged it right into the spotlight of critical inquiry. And religion didn't like that very much. It went scampering. But only Christianity could withstand that. There it stood alone. And it was a very clear presentation that Christianity invites critical inquiry. It invites investigation. You can't have a conference like this for most religious faiths. It makes no sense whatsoever. Because in those other religious faiths, it's all about your personal experience. Now, we have wonderful personal experience in Christianity. Don't dilute that for a moment. But here's the deal. Christianity is true whether you believe it or not. By the way, that shocks people in a lot of churches. Yeah. In fact, I remember reading that 1 Corinthians passage in a kind of a liberal Presbyterian church one time, and I remember a couple of people came up to admonish me afterwards, you need to be careful with that kind of stuff, I said, why? They go, well, who knows if that ever really happened, They were very, very concerned about that because they thought it was all about, I've had an experience of Jesus, and that's what I'm going to ride on the rest of my life. We don't need that. We don't need that at all. And it turns out the resurrection is key to this whole operation. Really is. Christianity is weird in that regard, that we make this single historical event so central and important. And I believe it was the Lord presenting us knowledge, something we could really understand in the typical ways of investigating things. In fact, it reminds me of a lecture I gave at the UCLA School of Medicine. Go Bruins, yeah. So, yeah, boo. USC fans. That's right. So I get this invitation, and they'd called Biola because they were looking for, a fundamentalist guy to give a talk on resurrection, because they were putting together this lunchtime lecture series at the medical school, and they wanted to invite a, kind of a Bible believer to talk about resurrection, because wouldn't that be a hoot, And so I'm driving I said yes immediately, and I'm driving into UCLA that day for this lunchtime lecture series, and I'm thinking to myself and going, it's good that they asked me to do this, because if dead people can come back to life, young medical students ought to know something about that. Yeah, made a lot of sense to me. So I get there, and I'm lecturing in an anatomy lecture hall. Have you ever seen one of these? They go almost straight up in the sky, People are up there, and by the way, they're all chewing on sandwiches, and so I give this presentation, and I gave about 1/3 of the jokes I've given tonight, because this was a very stately, thoughtful medical school, intimidating audience, and so here was the outline for my presentation. It appears that the historical record presents this idea that Jesus was alive at point A, he was dead at alive at point A, dead at point B, and alive again at point C. Deal with it. Now, they were stunned. I was stunned that they were stunned because I didn't know what they were stunned about. In fact, I could tell what kind of sandwich they were eating because their mouths were hanging open. Tuna, But we didn't have much time for Q&A, and so as soon as we closed it down, a small group of them came up, and they were peppering me with questions, and I think this one medical school kid was kind of speaking for the stunned nature of the group. This guy said, "This is not at all what I expected. You're making it sound like this stuff is like it's true." He obviously wasn't a philosophy major as an undergraduate. He was wrestling with this idea that you're making it sound like I can know it to be true through the same kinds of investigative tools I use in medicine and history and crime scene investigations and courts of law and so on. You're making it sound like that. I'm intrigued by that. Most religious ideas don't really turn me on because it's all about blind leaping and so on. But this I can sink my teeth into. One more quick story. Okay, so I go over to do you ever have those relatives you can't quite identify because there have been so many marriages and rearrangements in your family? So I go over to this relative of mine's house, right? His name's Alan, okay. Alan, he's a retired guy. He plays golf and he watches television, basically, and he's very good at both of them. And so I go over, and he's an armchair agnostic, and he loves to rib me about Christianity and my crazy beliefs and so on. And so if he's laying on the couch watching television and I come for a visit, he'll see me walking towards the room in which he reclines, and he sees me coming, and he's like a quick shooter. He can like reach for the remote control pointed at the TV without ever taking his eye off of me and going, doo, 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 doo. And he can like instinctively change it to the craziest religious programming available on television, okay? People with gigantic hair, people with blazing white Nehru jackets and all kinds of stuff, I'm looking to see if there's anybody okay, I think we're safe. Yeah. I don't know. Honestly, I don't really know what's going on there, but people were frothing and falling and all kinds of stuff. And I walk into the room and he goes, "Hey, here's your people." So one time I walk in, and it's near Christmas, I remember. And I'm walking towards the room, and he grabs the remote, and he goes, doo, doo, doo. He didn't get very far. And because he had landed on this documentary on the life of Jesus, and it was very interesting. And we both got taken into it right away because it was showing like three-dimensional models of ancient Jerusalem. It was showing what Jesus might have looked like based on the skeletal models of ancient Semitic men and so on. But it was a biography of the life of Jesus, and you know how these things go. They have a title sequence like, and and it disappears, and then they interview scholars in front of books, and out in the quad of the college and so on. So that's exactly what this was like. Well, they're doing a biography of Jesus, so eventually they're going to get to the crucifixion. And then they interview scholars in front of bookshelves and out in the quad and so on. And it was really amazing because there were a good number of liberal scholars in this group. They had actually thrown in a couple of conservatives, and that was kind of nice, But it didn't matter whether liberal, radical, critical, leftist, you name it, didn't matter because every one of them agreed that, oh yeah, Jesus was a real historical figure, and yes, you can pretty much take this to the bank. He was killed by a Roman crucifixion team in first century Jerusalem. Chisel it in stone, knowable history. No one should be doubting that. Haul them away if they have. Everybody across the board was saying this in this documentary. Well, then they get to the next segment, the resurrection. Then they interview the exact same group of scholars, and except for the couple of conservatives, almost all of them said something like, well, who can possibly know what happened in those tumultuous times so long, long ago? That's the sound of my head hitting the coffee table, And I'm yelling at the television, And I'm saying things like, wait a minute, just a second ago, they all agreed that Jesus, was killed by a Roman crucifixion team. That same body of evidence that led them to agree on that thing is, like one page over, the exact same body of evidence that leads us to believe that he likely came back from the dead. This is not about evidence anymore. Of course, my friend Alan's looking at me like, now I'm frothing and falling. But really, there's an important point there. The evidence is actually quite compelling that Jesus came back from the dead. The problem ends up being people don't have a worldview wide enough to handle such a thing. Now, I find that interesting that very often we are called narrow by the secular community, right? You're a narrow fundamentalist, a narrow Bible believer. But I've discovered it's their worldview that turns out to be the narrow one. If there is excellent reason to believe that a wonderful miracle, like somebody conquering death, has happened in human history, I'm not going to believe every report of a miracle, but if there's good reason to believe one has happened, we ought to be open to such a thing. Most of those scholars simply did not have a worldview that could be open to such a thing. So, at some point, it turns out not to be about the evidence. It turns out to be people's worldview. And I think one thing you'll get in this conference is you'll see the Christian worldview really does add up. You'll hear a wonderful lecture tonight on intelligent design. Is it reasonable to believe that God created life and caused it to flourish on planet Earth? Is it reasonable to believe that? If you walk out of here not thinking that it's reasonable to believe that, I think there might be something wrong. Even if you're a dyed-in-the-wool atheist and a committed Darwinist, right? You're a great-great-grandson of Thomas Huxley or something, and you're in the room tonight. All I'm saying is if you walk out thinking that it's not reasonable, I'm not even saying it's true. I'm simply, if it's not reasonable, then something might be wrong. Because the case is quite stunning, and it's much better than the secular world might ever want to admit. All right? We've got the goods on these things. And I'm stunned by the Bible itself, how the New Testament writers and the apostles, Peter and John, were just taken up by the idea that this is not about blind faith. You have to understand something. This really happened. Well, listen to Peter in 2 Peter 1:16. We didn't follow cleverly invented stories, muthoi, when we told you about the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. 1 John 1:1, John writes, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. They did everything they could to make sure you understood. Don't think this is just some sort of inner spiritual activity we're having. This is objective knowledge. You can know that this really happened. And by the way, the Old Testament prophets were big on objective knowledge, as was Jesus, as were the apostles that followed him. Think of the Old Testament. Elijah on Mount Carmel, right? I just read this in my daily Bible reading. It's quite a story in Kings chapter 18, where you got Elijah squaring off with the prophets of Baal. We ought to do this more often. Yeah? Elijah builds an altar, they build an altar, they throw big slabs of meat on it, and the prophets of Baal go first. They're dancing. I don't know how prophets of Baal dance. But just imagine, okay? Elijah is like, reclining in a chair, poking a long stick at them. Maybe your God's on the toilet, maybe he's asleep, it gets serious. They go on for days. Pretty soon they collapse, in a heap. Then it's Elijah's turn. Well, just to tweak him, he has people pour buckets of water over the offering. Presumably, this is going to keep it from spontaneously combusting, or something. Actually, I was teaching this to some fourth graders one time, and I said, why do you think they poured buckets of water over the offering? And the kid says, to make gravy. I thought, that's a keeper. But it's then the turn of Elijah, and you get the feeling that he just kind of winks, barely makes a move, wink, and down comes fire, takes up the offering, takes up the water, takes up the altar, takes up a couple of prophets of Baal. But it's a definitive demonstration that one is God and one is not. That's big. And there's stuff like that all through the Old Testament. This is not about blind leaping. It's a very important message. The apostles, I just read a couple of important verses where, no, we saw this, we touched it. But Jesus himself was big on this. When asked about his authority, they said, you need to demonstrate this authority. Show us a sign. And what did he say, to a wicked and perverse generation? I'm not going to show one of those, but tear down this temple, and I will raise it up again in 3 days. Right? That was going to be the great sign. Signs are meant for us to have knowledge. He wanted to demonstrate that this was true, and he telegraphed that to people. Probably the best example of this is in Mark chapter 2. I love this chapter. Mark chapter 2. Jesus is coming to Capernaum, right? A city on the Sea of Galilee. Maybe Peter's hometown. In fact, he may have been preaching in Peter's home. And Jesus is coming to town, and people are thrilled with this idea. I mean, this is before we had daily entertainment, video games and iPads and iPods and Googleplex theaters and sports stadiums and Friday night lights and all that stuff. So Jesus is coming to town, and it's an A ticket. And so people get there early. They load up this home in which Jesus is speaking. It is filled to overflowing. I always picture Jesus sort of in the middle teaching. But there were a couple of guys late to the party. I love these guys, 4 guys. There's guys like this all over this room where you would probably be late to the party because you love this paralytic guy down the block. And you heard Jesus has some sort of healing powers, and you wanted to give this guy a shot. So you don't get there early. You run and get your friend the paralytic. You put him on a mat, and you trot him down to where Jesus is. But you discover when you get there, you can't get near the place. There are people thick outside the home, straining to listen to what's going on inside. So somehow you are not daunted. You decide to get the paralytic up on top of the roof, right? I don't know how they did this. We'll have to wait for the Mel Gibson movie, to figure out, I don't know how they did this. But they get him up on the roof, and they start to dig through. I mean, think about this. There are a bunch of people inside, and the roof is like rumbling, and people are like, so glad I got here early. What in the world is going on? And even Jesus is probably taken aback by this. What is going on? And there's dirt starting to fall and leaves, and pretty soon, a beam of light breaks through. And of course, the light hits the dust that's in the air, and it's all ethereal, It just has that great spiritual feel. The hole gets bigger, more light pours through. And pretty soon a head pops through. The hole gets bigger. And if that's not enough, suddenly down comes this guy on a mat. And Jesus is watching this, Lands at Jesus' feet or somewhere in that proximity. And there's a hush. what's he going to say? What does he say? He says, something totally unexpected. Son, your sins are forgiven. That's probably how they reacted. In fact, they're probably thinking, after a moment, hey, good for him. You know? I hear Jesus might be able to make lunch. Now, the question for you is, why didn't they at that moment leap to their feet and say, hallelujah, happy day, this man's sins are forgiven, yay and amen. Why didn't they do that? Because they didn't know if it was really happening. They didn't. I mean, son, your sins are forgiven. If that man's sins are really being forgiven, that's an invisible spiritual act for which nobody in the room had really any solid evidence, right? I mean, think about this. Door bursts open in the back. This would be very dramatic, by the way, because this is a big room. And in walks a troop, and there's a man leading them. He's got long white robes and a beard and a staff. He's got sandals and a hat of some sort. He looks like Gandalf the White, And he's marching down this aisleway. He leaps up here. There's people following him, of course. And he kind of gently pushes me out of the way, and he stands before you, and he says, hello. Because that's what religious guys say, Or maybe he says, behold. Maybe he really hits it out of the park and says, lo and behold, But he says, in a very pious, religious tone, my children, your sins, they are forgiven. Now, why aren't you leaping to your feet saying, happy day, Because you don't know who this guy is or if he can do such a thing. Maybe you heard about this guy traipsing around this town, and suddenly here he is. But see, Jesus didn't want to leave it there, did he? He didn't want to leave it there. And this is why I love this chapter. Because here's the crescendo. He says this, so that you will, and here comes the operative word, so that you will know. So that you will know. So that you will know that the Son of Man has the authority on earth to forgive sins. Pick up your mat and walk. The guy picks up his mat. Maybe for the first time in his life, and begins to walk out of the room. The crowd begins to part, and the Gospel of Mark uses some of the strongest Greek language you can find. They were astonished. Jesus wanted them to know. Well, we want you to know. That's why we're holding an apologetics conference. We want you to know these things are true. If you're wallowing in blind faith, we want to ground you in the great truths, great historical truths of the gospel. Give you excellent reasons for the existence of God. Show you that God is indeed the creator, and you cannot understand biology without an intelligent designer, that the scriptures are reliable, and so on and on and on. I'm done. Let me introduce my colleague, J.P. Moreland, who will step right up here. He is a distinguished professor of philosophy at the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University, and one of my dear brothers in the Lord, and dear friends, and dear colleagues. And he is, most importantly, one of the most wonderful encouragers I've ever met in my life. He is amazing in terms of encouraging us in our academic work, in our pursuit of the Lord, and in our big-time kingdom work. I don't think Biola would have become the top trainer of philosophers in the planet, if it were not for J.P. Moreland. He's written a ton of books, some of which are the Kingdom Triangle. If you haven't read that, you ought to get a hold of that. In fact, if you have a computer right now and you're logged into the internet, just go to Amazon right now and make sure it's delivered by the time you get home. A book that you can pick up tonight called The God Question. I just can't recommend this more highly. And many other books. If you loving God with all your mind and so on, just go to Google his name. You'll see all of his material. He holds a PhD in philosophy from USC. He has a Master's of Theology from Dallas Seminary, and a Bachelor's in chemistry from the University of Missouri. He's just a brilliant, world-class philosopher, and he's on our side. This is really cool. J.P. Moreland, thanks.
Thank you, my dear brother. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Great to be with you. Bring you greetings from Southern California. A few years ago, I was in the Seattle airport coming back from a speaking engagement. And it was a Sunday morning, so I picked up the Seattle Times and made a beeline to the editorial page. And there, the lead editorial of the Seattle Times, which was a syndicated editorial that had been spread through a number of newspapers, and it covered at least 2/3 of the front page. I've actually kept it and have it at home. Was about a divided nation. And the article went on to say at that time that America was the most divided country it has ever been since the Civil War. And I believe that since that article was published, that the division among the American people has actually gotten worse in the last 4 or 5 years. What I found striking about the article was what the author identified as the fundamental issue that divided the American people. And he said there were basically two camps, and the issue that divides the American people is not primarily political, it's not primarily socioeconomic, it's not primarily gender, and it's not primarily racial. And that's one of those would be what you would hear on most of the talk shows and the news programs and the newspapers that cover our culture today. No, the author went on to say that the fundamental divide of the American people is over worldview. Worldview. Well, I couldn't believe it, because a number of us who are here this weekend have been saying this for years. And we hear Christians talk about worldview, but we very seldom hear the secular world talk about worldview. And he went on to say that America was fundamentally divided into two different worldviews. Now, he was wrong about that, and because he can be forgiven, he's a political scientist, not a philosopher. But tomorrow I'll say a little bit more about these worldviews, and in just a moment I'll tell you I believe there are 3 of them that are vying for allegiance among the American people. But the important thing that he went on to say was that we live in a time where the religion of Jesus is regarded as not only foolish to believe, but actually immoral. It is now believed widely that not only do you have to be ignorant to be a Christian, but there's got to be something immoral about you to follow the religion of Jesus. That you are fundamentally a bigoted person who is intolerant and wants to control the lives of other people if you follow New Testament Christianity. Not long ago, novelist Jane Smalley was talking about evangelical Christians, and she said, here is how their ignorance works. First, they put the fear of God into you. If you don't believe the literal word of the Bible, you'll burn in hell. Of course, the literal word of the Bible is tremendously contradictory, so you have to abdicate all critical thinking and accept a simple but logical system of belief that's dangerous to question. A corollary to this point is that we, make sure you understand that Satan resides in the toils and snares of complex thought, so it's best not to think at all. So that we are, at our core, hostile to reason. We're hostile to the mind. We're a people who do not value an intellectual life. We put that down. It's a threat to us. We prefer to be ignorant than to be educated. That's who we are, according to what many people think of us today. You probably remember Robert Reich, who was on President Clinton's cabinet, who wrote an article in a journal called The New Prospect, who basically said the following a few years ago. Now listen very carefully to what he's saying. The great conflict of the 21st century will not be between the West and terrorism. Terrorism is a tactic, not a belief. No, the true battle will be between modern civilization and anti-modernists, between those who believe in the primacy of the individual and those who believe that human beings owe their allegiance to a higher power, between those who give priority to life in this world and those who believe that human life is mere preparation for an existence beyond the grave, between those who believe in science, reason, and logic, and those who believe that truth is revealed through Scripture and religious dogma. Terrorism will disrupt and destroy lives, but terrorism itself is not the greatest danger we face. Conservative religious believers is the greatest danger we face. And so you and I now are perceived not only as ignorant and hostile to reason, but we are perceived as extremely morally dangerous to the welfare and health of American culture. Now, I believe that these attitudes are an expression of a worldview struggle among three worldviews. And again, I'll talk about these in more detail tomorrow, but I want to tell you what they are this evening and just say a word about them. Happily, the first worldview is ethical monotheism, of which Christianity is the main form. Ethical monotheism would be roughly the idea that there is a God who created us, to whom we owe allegiance, and who imposes duties and moral obligations on us by giving us the moral law. So that there is a creator God to whom we're responsible. Christianity is by far the main form of ethical monotheism. So for practical purposes, we could say the first worldview that is in the marketplace of ideas is Christianity. The second worldview, which clearly has the most authority today in American culture, is the worldview of scientific naturalism. And scientific naturalism has both an epistemology and an ontology. Those are $1.98 words that mean the following. An epistemology would be a theory of how we know things. And the epistemology, or the theory of how we know things, is basically the idea that the fundamental and only way we can know reality is through the hard sciences. So that if you can test it in chemistry and physics and biology, you can know it. If it is not something that you can test and prove in the hard sciences, you can't know it. This is why we will not get upset and call somebody intolerant who is legislating chemistry, but we will call someone intolerant who's legislating morality and religion, because we think we can know who's right in chemistry, but we don't think anybody can know who's right in religion and ethics, for example, because they're not testable, supposedly, scientifically. So an example of this, a few years ago, on the cover of Time magazine, was a story about how the world was going to eventually end. And the author said the following, which was really quite offensive to me as a Christian. He said, "For centuries, indeed millennia, the human race has wanted to know how all this would end. Unfortunately, until the last few years, the only way we could try to answer those questions was through religion and philosophy, which amount to nothing but idle speculation. Now, for the first time in human history," the Time article went on to say, "science has moved into this area of investigation, and for the first time in human history, we have finally gained answers to our questions." Now, I'm not against real science. Paul Nelson is going to come up here a little bit later this evening and will give you one of the most stimulating lectures, I believe, you've ever heard on the science of life. I'm for genuine science. I've dedicated my life to offsetting the claim that science is the only way we have of knowing things. And this first worldview's epistemology is the idea that the only form of knowledge of reality we have is through the hard sciences. And this has now trickled down into the culture at large. The ontology, that is the view of what is real, held by the naturalist, is called physicalism or materialism. And it's the idea that the physical world is all there is. The physical world is all there is. Now, this idea has even affected the Christian community. So, for example, many times I will lecture in churches on the nature of animal souls, what a dog's soul would be like, or what a frog's soul would be like. And people start looking at one another when I do that and saying, "Did he say animal souls?" And what they don't realize is that the church has always taught that animals have souls. It's only been since the time of Darwin and Descartes, who basically said animals don't have souls. It's not the Christian religion. Well, then why do people in America, in the church, not know animals have souls? because we've been more influenced in our teaching by Darwin and by science than we have by the history of Christian thought on this subject. Now, that's not to make us feel bad. It's just the simple fact that we have been influenced by naturalism without even knowing it. This is not an unimportant question. The third worldview is called postmodernism. And for our purposes, while this is a multicolored tunic, the basic form that I want to talk about is philosophical postmodernism, which is roughly the idea that all truth and all reality is relative to your community. All truth and all reality is relative to your community. What is real and true for one community may not be real and true for another community, and there's nobody who's right and there's nobody who's wrong. Everything is radically relative to your group. And different groups can have different views, and they're both right in their own way. And an example of this was a movie that I saw on an airplane trip where I was going from California to North Carolina, and the in-flight movie was called A Stolen Summer. It was the story of two little boys in the Chicago area who were home for summer vacation from school. One of the boys, I'm going to say, was probably 14 or 15, and he had a little friend who was about 11 or 12. The older boy was Catholic. The younger boy was Jewish. And during the summer, the Catholic boy was concerned that his Jewish friend was not going to go to heaven because he didn't know Jesus. So he did everything he could to try to bring his little Jewish friend to faith in Jesus as his Messiah during the summer. Tried to get him to pray in the garage, brought him to see his pastor, did a number of things like that. Toward the end of the summer, the little Jewish boy got sick and died. The closing scene of the movie is where the Catholic boy has just watched the funeral of his little Jewish friend, and he's outside the synagogue, and he meets the mother and father of the Jewish boy, and they start talking, and he says to the mother and father, "I can't tell you how embarrassed and sorry I am for what I tried to do to your son this summer. Because I now realize when it comes to God, it really doesn't matter what you believe. What matters is that you love people." Now, you're going to go out and say, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life," in a culture that believes that. Makes it tough. Makes it tough. And the fundamental fight that we're in today between these two worldviews, naturalism and postmodernism, is not simply a struggle about truth. Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't hear me say anything else in my time this evening, I want you to realize the fundamental struggle is over knowledge of truth, not truth. If I go to a college campus and I tell them Jesus has changed my life and made a difference, they'll yawn and say, "That's wonderful for you." If I go on a college campus and say that I think Christianity is true, people don't particularly enjoy that message. If I go on a college campus and I say not only is Christianity true, but you can actually know that it's true, that is like teeing off a golf ball in the shower. Right back at you pretty quickly. Because we are in our culture undergoing a struggle for who gets to say what knowledge is and how broad it is. Can you actually know that there's a God? Can you actually know that there's life after death? See, in the church today, what we've done in this struggle is we have withdrawn and separated faith from reason. So that Christianity is a religion about faith. It is not a religion about knowledge. And the Bible has more to say about knowledge than it does faith. In fact, a good definition of faith is trusting or having confidence in what I know to be true. Far from being the opposite of knowledge, faith is based on knowledge. I was speaking in Schenectady, New York, in an auditorium about this size, giving an evangelistic talk on why I believed in the Christian God. There was a Q&A time with microphones. The first two questions were obviously by unbelievers. The third questioner was a Christian sister who got up and said, "Dr. Moreland, your talk has troubled me this evening. I have to be honest with you. And what bothers me is this: if you prove that there's a God, what room are you leaving for faith?" Now, do you see, in her view, The more you actually know God is real, the less room you have for faith in him. You understand? As opposed to saying the more I know God is real, the greater my faith will be, which seems more sensible to me. Where did she get that idea? Can I be frank with you? And I'd rather be real frank than dead earnest. She got it from us, from our culture, from the evangelical subculture is where she got it. Because we have retreated intellectually from the war because we're afraid to get involved in it between naturalism, postmodernism, and Christianity. And as a result, we have retreated to faith only as opposed to faith based on knowledge. And what we want to say this weekend is that the Christian religion is a religion that can actually be known to be true. I want to close my remarks this evening by looking very quickly at a biblical text. If you have the scriptures, turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. 2 Corinthians chapter 10. I wish I had time this evening to tell you some demon stories where I have been involved in exorcising demons from people. I've had the privilege of doing that. You heard the prophets of Baal illustration. Do you know that those kinds of showdowns are actually happening around the world in other cultures? I have a picture of a major evangelistic event that happened in India where there were a group of witch doctors and pagan worshipers that were trying to disrupt this multi-thousand member gathering to hear the gospel of Jesus. And lightning came out of a cloudless sky and struck a tree and burned it halfway down and killed the main witch doctor. These kinds of Elijah showdowns weren't for biblical times. They're happening all around the world today. But many of you don't believe that kind of thing. And you have not seen miracles because you don't actually believe the Bible because you've been sucked into a naturalist view of the world. I could talk all day about this. When you get sick, do you go to the doctor first, or is your first thought to pray for healing? Don't go to a doctor first. Pray for healing. Now, I'm for doctors. It's a both and, but what's your first response? And if it's medicine, there's a problem. You've bought into a natural worldview, not a Christian view of the world. It ought to be prayer for healing first and medicine second. But the reason we don't pray for healing is because we're too much in control and we don't try it very much, and so we don't see a lot happen. And that's because we've bought into a naturalist view of the world. Now, demons are real. They're not doctrines. And they're people. They're not humans, they're people. They're disembodied centers of consciousness. They're persons without bodies. Now, how do persons control other persons? How could you get someone to control a group of people? If you could control how they think and feel, then you can control those people. Does that make sense to you? Now, in 2 Corinthians 10, we have the second most important passage on spiritual warfare in the New Testament. And it says the following in verse 3. For though we walk according to the flesh, we do not war. Although we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but are divinely powerful for the destruction of what? When you pray to have a demon leave a person, you pray against the person, the demon, the invisible person. Here the target is not the demon, it is a fortress. The target is a fortress. Now, what exactly is a fortress? Well, we're told in the next verse, we are destroying speculations and every lofty thought raised up against the knowledge of God. What is a fortress? It is a theory. It is a set of ideas. Let me give you a fortress. We evolved through a blind process of evolution to where we came to today, and that's the true story of how you got here. That is a fortress. Let me give you another fortress. Homosexuality is caused by genetics and brain chemistry, and therefore you are not responsible for homosexual behavior any more than you're responsible for your skin color, which also is not something in your control. That is a fortress. Let me give you another fortress. You can only know something if you can see it. Now, the point I am making is that in literature and in the editorial pages of the newspaper and in the news programs we watch, and in Time and Newsweek magazine, and in the science journals, and in the field of philosophy, and in the colleges and universities and the public schools, ideas are being generated that are either friendly to, neutral with respect to, or hostile to Christianity. And a part of engaging in spiritual warfare is the destruction of those ideas that undermine the Christian faith. How do you destroy an idea? You argue against it. The way you destroy a fortress is that you argue. You learn to engage in apologetics. It follows from this that if we're in a struggle of knowledge between naturalism, postmodernism, and Christianity, it follows that if this struggle is really a struggle about ideas, it is a part of spiritual warfare to engage in apologetics. Apologetics is a part of our calling to engage in the unseen forces of this world, including the ideas that are generated by the world, the flesh, and the devil that are raised up against the Christian religion. That's why I'm excited to be here. That's why I and my colleagues have devoted our lives to being your ambassadors and the ambassadors of Christ in the academic community, but also in having an opportunity to engage our brothers and sisters in conferences of this sort to upgrade our ability to defend what we believe and why. And I tell you, I cannot wait to hear from Paul Nelson. It's been a long time since I've had a chance to hear him speak, and he's one of the leading experts that we have in the country on the creation-evolution controversy. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.